"I deserved nothing," my son said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, and I smiled because he had no idea what was sitting quietly in my purse. The conference room felt colder than it should have, despite the late spring sun pouring through the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago, the kind of room designed for serious conversations and final decisions. Polished oak table, leather chairs, and a silence that carried weight, the kind that presses against your chest. My husband had been gone for exactly 12 days, and this was how our story was being closed, not with grief, not with reflection, but with calculation. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my posture straight, my expression calm, the same way I had sat beside my husband at charity dinners and holiday gatherings for over 30 years, while across from me, Daniel leaned forward, elbows planted, fingers tapping against the table with impatience he wasn't even trying to hide, his expensive watch catching the light every time his wrist moved, as if time itself belonged to him now. Around us, a handful of relatives and 2 family friends avoided eye contact, pretending to study the papers in front of them or the city skyline beyond the glass, no one wanting to be caught in the middle of what they all clearly believed was inevitable, that a son inherits and a widow steps aside. I noticed everything, the way Daniel didn't look at me once, the way his jaw tightened slightly whenever the lawyer shuffled documents, the way he exhaled sharply as if this entire process was nothing more than a formality delaying what he already considered his. Charles Bennett sat at the head of the table, composed, precise, his silver hair perfectly in place, his glasses resting low on his nose as he reviewed the file in front of him, and though he hadn't spoken yet, there was a stillness about him that didn't match Daniel's certainty, a quiet authority that didn't rush, didn't bend, didn't react. I had known Charles for over 2 decades, long enough to recognize that silence from him wasn't hesitation, it was timing. Daniel finally broke the quiet with a short, humorless laugh, leaning back slightly as if he were granting the room permission to relax. "Let's not drag this out," he said. His voice sharp, confident, almost bored. "We all know how this works. Dad built everything. I'm his only son. There's no reason to complicate things." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment someone shifted in their seat, another person cleared their throat, but no one challenged him, no one corrected him, and certainly no one defended me. I felt the weight of that more than his words. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blazer, smoothing out a wrinkle that didn't really exist, a small, deliberate movement that kept my hands steady and my expression unchanged. Daniel turned his head just enough to gesture vaguely in my direction, not even meeting my eyes, and with all due respect, he added, though there was none in his tone, "Mom doesn't need anything. She's been taken care of her whole life." A few heads nodded, not in agreement, but in surrender to the narrative he was building, the one where I was a footnote, an afterthought, a dependent. I let the silence stretch, let his words settle, let the room accept what it thought it understood, because I had learned something over the years, something Daniel had not, that the moment people feel most certain is usually the moment they're most wrong. I lifted my chin slightly and allowed a small, polite smile to form, the kind that revealed nothing and promised even less, while my fingers rested lightly against the leather of my handbag, feeling the edge of a single folded document inside, the only one in this entire room that actually mattered. The room did not move after he finished speaking, but something in the air shifted, subtle and almost invisible, like the moment before a storm changes direction, and I noticed how Charles Bennett's pen stopped midline, just for a fraction of a second, before he set it down with deliberate care. Daniel mistook the silence for agreement. I could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, in the way he leaned back further into his chair as though the outcome had already been sealed in his favor, as though this was no longer a conversation but a confirmation. I kept my eyes lowered for a moment, studying the faint grain of the oak table, tracing its lines without really seeing them, giving myself the space to listen, to measure, to let every small detail settle into place. Someone across the table adjusted their glasses. Another shifted a stack of papers that did not need shifting. Small movements people make when they do not know where to look, when they do not want to be part of what is unfolding but cannot leave. Daniel exhaled again, louder this time, impatience creeping back into his voice as he turned toward Charles. "So let us proceed," he said, tapping his fingers twice against the table, each tap sharp and controlled. "I have a call in less than an hour." It was such a small sentence, but it revealed everything, not grief, not reflection, not even curiosity, just urgency, as if the end of his father's life was an item on his schedule, something to finalize and move past. I lifted my gaze then, not toward Daniel but toward Charles, and for the briefest moment our eyes met, and there it was again, that same quiet understanding I had recognized years ago, the kind that does not need explanation, the kind that waits until the exact right second. He did not nod, he did not smile, but there was a steadiness in his expression that did not belong to the version of events Daniel was so confident about. I let my fingers rest lightly against my handbag again, feeling the folded edge of the document inside, remembering the afternoon just 4 days before my husband passed, the way the light had come through the hospital window in soft strips across the floor, the way his voice had been weaker but certain when he said, "Trust Charles." I had not asked questions then, I had not needed to, because after 32 years of marriage, I knew the difference between a passing thought and a final decision. Back in the room, Daniel shifted forward again, his patience thinning as he glanced around at the others, almost inviting them to support him, but no one spoke, no one offered him the confirmation he expected, and that seemed to irritate him more than anything else. "There is no amendment, right?" he said suddenly, turning back to Charles with a faint edge of challenge in his tone, as if daring him to complicate things, as if the idea itself was inconvenient. I did not move, did not react, did not even change my expression, but inside I felt something settle into place with quiet certainty, because the question itself told me everything I needed to know. He had not checked, he had not asked, he had simply assumed. And assumptions, I had learned, are where people lose everything. Charles did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind of pause that makes people shift in their seats and reconsider what they thought they understood, and I watched as Daniel's confidence flickered for the first time, not gone but slightly unsettled, like a reflection disturbed by a ripple. Charles adjusted the papers in front of him with precise, measured movements, aligning the edges, smoothing the top page, as if the order of the documents mattered more than the urgency in Daniel's voice, and when he finally looked up, he did not look at Daniel first, he looked at me, briefly, just enough to confirm something unspoken. Then he turned his attention back to the room. "We will review all relevant documents," he said evenly, his tone calm, professional, and completely unaffected by the tension building around him, and there was something in the way he said it, something deliberate, that did not match Daniel's expectation of a quick confirmation. Daniel let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite irritation, but close enough to both, and leaned forward again, placing his palms flat on the table as if to anchor the moment. "There is nothing to review," he said, his voice sharper now, more insistent. "My father made his intentions clear for years." The statement was bold, but it rested entirely on assumption, and I could see that now, the way certainty had replaced verification, the way confidence had replaced caution. I kept my expression unchanged, my posture steady, but inside, I felt a quiet clarity settle deeper, because every word Daniel spoke was building a structure that could not hold. Across the table, one of the relatives finally glanced in my direction, just for a second, as if searching for a reaction, a protest, anything that might interrupt what was unfolding, but I gave them nothing, only the same composed stillness, the same small, polite smile that revealed nothing at all. Charles reached for a separate folder then, one that had not been part of the main stack, and placed it carefully in front of him, his fingers resting on it for a moment before he opened it, and I noticed how Daniel's eyes followed the movement immediately, his focus narrowing, his impatience shifting into something else, something less certain. "As I was saying," Charles continued, his voice steady, "we will proceed according to the full and most current legal documentation on record." The phrasing was precise, intentional, and it landed differently than everything that had been said before, because it introduced something Daniel had not accounted for, something beyond his assumptions. Daniel straightened slightly, his jaw tightening as he watched Charles open the folder, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not speak right away, as if waiting, calculating, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. I let my hand rest more firmly against my handbag now, feeling the outline of the folded document inside, no longer just a quiet presence, but a certainty, and I realized then that the room had already begun to change, not dramatically, not loudly, but in small, undeniable ways, in the shifting attention, in the silence that now carried expectation instead of agreement, in the subtle awareness that what everyone thought they knew was about to be rewritten. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed louder than it should have as Charles turned the first page inside the separate folder, a quiet, deliberate movement that drew every eye in the room without him needing to ask for attention, and I watched Daniel closely then, the way his posture shifted just slightly forward again, not with confidence this time, but with focus, as if he were trying to catch something before it fully formed. Charles did not rush, he never did, and that steadiness now felt like a contrast to the tension building around the table, a contrast that made the silence heavier, more intentional. "Before we proceed further," he said, his voice even and measured, "it is important that we review the most recent additions to the estate documents." The word additions landed differently than everything that had come before, and I saw it register in Daniel's expression, not fully understood yet, but enough to interrupt the certainty he had been holding onto so tightly. "Additions," Daniel repeated, the word coming out sharper than he intended, his brows pulling together slightly as he looked from Charles to the folder and back again, trying to place it, trying to remember something he had never actually confirmed. Charles gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to Daniel but to the process itself, and continued, "Yes, additions that were executed and signed in accordance with state law." The room seemed to narrow around those words, conversations that had not been spoken suddenly becoming impossible, and for the first time since we sat down, Daniel did not immediately fill the silence. He simply stared, waiting. I remained still, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my breathing steady, but inside, I felt the memory return with quiet clarity, the hospital room, the muted hum of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic in the air, and my husband's voice, softer than I had ever heard it, but unwavering when it mattered most. He had not spoken in long explanations, he had not needed to, just a few precise sentences, a look that held meaning I had understood without question, and then the simple instruction to trust Charles. I had signed where I was asked to sign, not out of blind faith but out of recognition, because I knew him, I knew the difference between a man who hoped and a man who decided, and in those final days he had been very clear about what he was deciding. Back in the present, Daniel shifted in his chair, his hand moving to the edge of the table, fingers curling slightly as if trying to hold on to something that was beginning to slip. "I was not informed of any additions," he said, his voice tighter now, more controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. Charles met his gaze calmly, without challenge, without apology. "The documentation was executed privately, as is sometimes the case," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to unsettle Daniel more than anything else, because it left no space for argument, no opening to push against. Around the table, the others had gone completely still now, no more shifting papers, no more avoiding glances, just quiet attention fixed on Charles and the folder in front of him, as if everyone suddenly understood that what they were about to hear would not match what they had assumed. I allowed my fingers to rest once more against my handbag, feeling the edge of the folded document inside, no longer just a hidden detail but a quiet confirmation of everything that was about to unfold, and I realized then that the moment had already turned, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a single word that changed the direction of everything: additions. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the folder as if staring long enough might change what was inside it, and I could see the calculation behind his eyes now, not the confident assumption from before, but something sharper, more urgent, as though he were trying to reconstruct a version of events that would still lead to the outcome he expected. "That does not make sense," he said finally, his voice lower, more controlled, but carrying a tension that had not been there before. "My father discussed his plans with me." The statement sounded certain, but it lacked something now. It lacked the weight it had carried earlier, because it was no longer standing alone, it was being measured against something real, something documented. Charles did not respond immediately. He simply opened the folder fully and adjusted the top page so it lay flat against the table, his movements precise, almost methodical, as if each second he took mattered more than any argument Daniel could make. "What was discussed informally," Charles said without looking up yet, "and what was executed legally are not always the same." The distinction was simple, but it cut cleanly through the assumptions that had filled the room just minutes ago, and I noticed how one of the relatives shifted in their chair again, this time not out of discomfort, but out of attention, as if something important was finally beginning to take shape. Daniel's hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table, his fingers pressing into the wood, not hard enough to draw attention, but enough to reveal what he was trying to contain. "So you are saying there is a change," he said, his words measured carefully now, each one placed with more caution than before, as though he were testing the ground beneath him. Charles lifted his gaze then, meeting Daniel's eyes directly for the first time since the folder had been opened, and there was no hesitation there, no uncertainty, only clarity. "I am saying," he replied evenly, "that your father made a final decision, and that decision is documented here." The room seemed to settle into a deeper silence, one that no longer belonged to expectation but to realization, and I could feel it in the way the air itself felt heavier, more focused, as if everyone present understood that whatever came next would not be undone by opinion or objection. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, but inside I felt a quiet steadiness, not satisfaction, not relief, just certainty, because this was not a moment that had appeared suddenly. It had been set in motion days before, in a quiet room where decisions had been made without audience, without pressure, without the need to convince anyone. Daniel looked down briefly at the documents in front of Charles, then back up again, his jaw tightening as if he were about to speak, but no words came immediately, and that pause said more than anything he had said so far. He was no longer leading the room, no longer controlling the direction of the conversation, and that shift, subtle but undeniable, was something he could not ignore. I let my fingers rest once more against my handbag, feeling the outline of the folded paper inside, and I realized then that I no longer needed to anticipate what would happen next, because the moment had already begun to unfold exactly as it was meant to, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that left no room for doubt. Charles turned the page with the same steady precision, and when he began to read, his voice did not rise or fall, it remained even, controlled, as though the words themselves carried enough weight without any need for emphasis, and that made every sentence land with quiet finality. "This amendment," he said, his eyes briefly scanning the document before continuing, "was signed and witnessed in full compliance with Illinois state law, and it supersedes all prior versions of the estate plan." The phrase supersedes settled heavily into the room, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and I saw the exact moment Daniel understood what it meant, not fully, not yet, but enough for his expression to change, the certainty replaced by something tighter, something less stable. "That is not possible," he said quickly, almost instinctively, as if rejecting the words could undo them, his voice sharper now, the control he had tried to maintain slipping just slightly at the edges. Charles did not react to the interruption, did not even pause. Longer than necessary before continuing, his tone unchanged. "The document outlines a revised distribution of all assets, including but not limited to real property, financial accounts, and controlling interests in family holdings." Each category was delivered with calm clarity, each one reinforcing that this was not a minor adjustment, not a technical correction, but a complete redefinition of everything Daniel believed he already owned. Around the table, the silence deepened again, but this time it was different, no longer passive, no longer uncertain, but attentive, as if every person present understood they were witnessing a shift that could not be reversed once spoken aloud. Daniel leaned forward abruptly, his hand moving toward the document as though proximity might grant him some control over it, but he stopped just short of touching it, his fingers hovering for a brief second before pulling back, as if even he recognized that this was no longer his to handle. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice lower now, measured, but carrying an urgency he could not fully conceal, and for the first time since the meeting began, it was a question, not a declaration. Charles lifted his gaze slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to acknowledge, and then continued reading. "The entirety of the estate is to be transferred to Margaret Whitmore, with specific conditions governing any future distribution at her sole discretion." The words were simple, direct, and complete, leaving no room for interpretation, and as they settled into the space between us, I felt the shift fully take hold, not as a surge of emotion, but as a quiet alignment of truth with what had already been decided days ago. Daniel did not speak immediately, and that silence from him was louder than anything he had said before, his posture rigid now, his gaze fixed somewhere between the document and the table, as if trying to process a reality that refused to match his expectations. I remained exactly as I had been from the beginning, my hand still, my expression calm, my breathing even, but inside there was a clarity that no longer needed confirmation, because the moment had arrived not with confrontation, but with a single statement that changed everything without raising its voice. Daniel let out a breath that was almost a laugh but carried no humor, the kind of sound people make when reality refuses to align with what they have already decided is true, and he leaned back slowly, his eyes still locked on the document as if it might change if he looked at it long enough. "That is not what he told me," he said, his voice quieter now but tighter, each word controlled as if forcing calm where it no longer came naturally. Charles did not respond immediately, allowing the statement to sit in the air without interruption, and that silence again did its work, drawing attention not to the claim itself, but to its weakness, because it was no longer supported by anything tangible. "Verbal discussions," Charles said after a moment, his tone steady and neutral, "do not override executed legal documents." The sentence was simple, but it closed a door Daniel had been trying to keep open, and I saw it in the way his jaw tightened again, the way his shoulders shifted as if adjusting to a weight he had not expected to carry. Around the table, the others remained still, but their attention had fully shifted now, no longer drifting or uncertain, but fixed, as if everyone present understood that the version of events they had quietly accepted earlier had already dissolved. Daniel's gaze moved then not to Charles but finally to me, and for the first time since we entered the room, he actually looked at me, really looked, not past me, not around me, but directly at me, searching for something, an explanation, a reaction, anything that might give him a foothold in what was happening. I held his gaze calmly, my expression unchanged, not challenging, not inviting, simply present, and I saw the moment he realized that I was not surprised, that I had not been caught off guard, that I had known. It was a small realization, but it shifted something deeper than the documents on the table, because it told him that this was not a mistake, not a last-minute change but something intentional. "You knew," he said, the words coming out lower, almost restrained, but carrying more weight than anything he had said before. I did not answer right away, not because I needed time, but because the moment did not require urgency, and I had learned long ago that silence, when placed correctly, could say more than any explanation. I adjusted my posture slightly, smoothing the fabric of my blazer with a calm, deliberate motion, and then met his gaze again. "I trusted your father," I said simply, my voice steady, without emphasis, without accusation, just a statement of fact. The words settled between us, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that did not invite argument. Daniel looked back toward the document again, his expression tightening as if trying to reconcile what he had believed with what was now undeniable, and I could see the shift fully now, not just in the room but in him, the loss of control, the loss of certainty, the realization that the outcome had already been decided without him. Charles closed the folder gently, the sound soft but definitive, and rested his hand on top of it as if marking the end of something, and in that quiet, measured gesture, the moment completed itself, not with confrontation, not with raised voices, but with a simple, undeniable truth that no one in the room could now ignore. No one spoke after that, not immediately, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain or shifting. It was settled, as if the room itself had accepted what had just been confirmed, and I could feel it in the stillness around the table, in the way no one reached for their papers, no one cleared their throat, no one tried to redirect the conversation back to something familiar. Daniel remained seated, but there was a difference now, subtle but unmistakable, his posture no longer leaning forward with expectation, but held in place by something heavier, something that did not allow easy movement. He looked at Charles again, then back at the closed folder, as if searching for an angle, a question, something that could reopen what had just been finalized, but nothing came, and that absence of words spoke louder than anything he could have said. "There must be some kind of condition," he said finally, his voice quieter, more measured, but still reaching, still trying to reclaim ground that had already shifted beneath him. Charles did not hesitate this time. "There are conditions," he replied calmly, "but they do not alter the transfer of ownership." The clarity of that answer left no space for reinterpretation, and I saw Daniel's gaze drop for a brief second, not in defeat but in recognition, the kind that arrives when there is nothing left to challenge. I remained still, my hands resting lightly against the leather of my handbag, my expression composed, but inside I felt something different now, not relief, not triumph, but a quiet sense of alignment, as if everything had returned to where it was always meant to be. One of the relatives shifted slightly in their chair, finally breaking the stillness with a small movement, but even that felt restrained, as though no one wanted to disturb what had just been established. Daniel leaned back slowly, his eyes no longer fixed on the documents, but somewhere beyond them, unfocused, as if recalculating a future that no longer matched the one he had walked into the room expecting. "So that is it," he said after a moment, not really asking, not really stating, just acknowledging, And for the first time there was no edge in his voice, no impatience, only a quiet acceptance that did not need to be spoken more clearly. Charles gave a slight nod, not dramatic, not final in tone but sufficient. "That is the current legal standing of the estate," he said, and with that, the matter was no longer open for interpretation. I adjusted my sleeve again, a small, familiar motion, and then allowed my gaze to move briefly around the room, taking in the faces that had earlier avoided mine, now looking with a different kind of attention, not sympathy, not judgment but awareness. The narrative they had accepted at the beginning had changed, and with it, the position each of us held within it. I did not speak, did not explain, did not justify, because none of that was necessary anymore. And I understood then that the power in the room had not shifted with noise or confrontation, but with something far quieter, something that had been decided long before any of us sat down at this table, something that did not need to announce itself to be real. I stood up before anyone asked me to, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but with the same quiet control I had carried into the room, and the subtle movement alone was enough to draw every eye back to me, not because I needed them to look, but because they understood that something had concluded. The chair slid back with a soft sound against the floor, barely audible, but in the stillness of the room it marked a clear transition from waiting to finality, from uncertainty to something far more defined. I reached for my handbag, my fingers closing gently around the handle, feeling the familiar weight of it, and for a brief moment I paused, not out of hesitation but out of acknowledgement, because this was the point where everything that had been assumed about me, about my place in this family, had quietly been rewritten without a single raised voice. Daniel remained seated, his posture still, his gaze lowered now, not fixed on the documents anymore, not searching for answers in Charles, but somewhere inward, as if recalculating something he had never expected to question. He did not stop me as I stood, did not speak my name, did not offer a final challenge, and that silence from him felt more complete than any argument could have been, because it carried recognition, even if he would never say it out loud. I looked at him then, not for long, not in a way that lingered, just enough to acknowledge the moment, and there was something different in his expression now, not understanding, not acceptance but awareness, the kind that comes too late to change the outcome. I did not need to say anything more to him, did not need to explain what had already been made clear, because explanations belong to moments of doubt, and there was none left in this room. I turned slightly toward Charles, offering a small, composed nod, a silent recognition of the role he had played, and he returned it just as subtly, professional as always, but with a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken. Around the table, no one moved to stop me, no one attempted to fill the silence with polite conversation or forced closure, because they understood, as I did, that nothing more needed to be said. I took a step toward the door, then another, the sound of my heels measured and steady against the floor, each step carrying me further from the version of myself they had assumed I would be, the one who would sit quietly and accept whatever was decided for her. At the door I paused briefly, my hand resting on the handle, and without turning back, I allowed myself a final thought, not spoken, not shared, but clear and complete. Some people inherit what they expect, and some people inherit what is true. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the room exactly as it was, quiet, still, and finally aware of what had always been there.